Oh man, I love listening to Jay. I always feel warm and fuzzy inside afterwards. So I'm a little bit more like the President Obama than these two in that I need a teleprompter if I'm going to be any good. So that's what I got that PowerPoint slide for. So I'm going to be talking about hydraulic fracturing. So essentially, I just want to kind of answer the question, put this in context. Where do we get our energy? Why is this important? And then just kind of talk about what fracking is and what are the environmental and economic impacts of it. So here we go. This is a graphic that I made in Microsoft Paint because I majored in graphics design. But you'll see at the top there, wind and solar, the sources of energy that we hear the most about, make up the smallest part of the pyramid. So it's kind of like the fats and sweets. You're not really supposed to try and rely on that. But you have oil, coal, and natural gas, and that kind of makes up that base. And that's really what we're going to be talking about because we've heard Jay was talking about peak oil, how we thought we were going to run out. And I always like to erase the graph from 2008 until the question mark. So that arrow is pointing towards the lower 48 oil production. Alaska kind of bailed us out all that time, but throughout the lower United States, we've been producing less and less oil, and that trend went for natural gas too. So between 2007 and 2013, we actually decreased the amount of natural gas we were producing by 25%, a quarter of our entire production in areas where we were not producing natural gas using fracking or shale. So people were thinking we were running out, but the great thing is that's not true. We're actually producing more than we've been producing in a really long time. Right now, Saudi Arabia is producing more than we are because they're trying to decrease the price of oil. But we were producing more oil than they were for a while, and we're already producing more natural gas than the Russians. So for a while, we were number one in both of those things, which is really great from a foreign policy perspective and just an energy policy prices perspective as well. So this is just kind of a visual representation of where we're doing this, and really I only put this slide in there so I can get my don't take it for granted pun. But you'll see we have the Marcellus Shale over there in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, parts of Ohio, and then a lot of the oil production's happening in Texas in the Permian, Eagle Ford, and then obviously we've all heard about the Bakken miracle where we have a lot of oil production out in North Dakota. So I just kind of want to explain why we frack, because I think a lot of us know that we're injecting water and sand down into the rocks in order to make them kind of bleed more oil and gas, if you will, but we don't quite understand what it looks like. So this one on the left here, that's what a conventional reservoir looked like. We had a lot of oil, and it was in the pore space in between the sand grains, so it would kind of all flow together. But on the right there, you've got a shale formation. So all it's little pockets, it's all trapped in place. So if you were trying to drill through there, you wouldn't have very good luck extracting that resource. So I like to think of shale as bubble wrap. You got to pop it in order to have fun. That's it's kind of a visual representation for natural gas. So that's what it would look like if you were doing a diagram for drilling. You can see that all the pore space for the conventional reservoir kind of lends itself to getting sucked up through the middle there. But if you look at the horizontal one there, the resource is still stuck in place. And the reason I have the water, the blue one there with all the little sand grains in there, is because every diagram I've seen shows that it's just an underground river, and that drives me nuts. Groundwater is just water in the pore space between sand grains and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to give you guys a false representation. I actually made this one too. So fracturing the rock. So we're going down 7,000 feet. So that's a lot of rock. That's over a mile deep in order to harness this resource. And you see where that turns there? Jay Lair always talks about this. It takes about 1,500 feet in order to make that turn. So that's a lot of rock that you have to kind of just have separating the water table. So you'll have the pump trucks on the top, but look at where that water table is. It's closer to 0 feet than it is to where we're fracking. So we're using about 2 to 4 million gallons of water. We're using about 5,000 tons of sand per well, and that's, I do a lot of research on the sand too. You wouldn't think you'd have to, but you do. And then we talk about the chemical additives a little bit. So let's talk about the fractures. So when you make these fractures in the rock, the pressure that you're pumping that water into the formation expands those fractures so they can be bigger. And what you do is you lodge these sand grains in there in order to keep those fractures open after you decompress the formation. So they act like pillars at the Parthenon. Just think about if you wiped out all those pillars, that's what you would have inside of these rock formations. So you can just kind of see the oil and gas that flow through the proppant there is what they call it. They call it a proppant. It's just sand. So let's talk about the environmental impacts. Water, chemicals, earthquakes, oh my. But I do want to be serious about this because everything does have an impact, and if anybody tells you that there's some sort of economic activity that doesn't have an impact, they're not being completely intellectually honest, because even tourism, which is promoted as a very green kind of great way to stimulate an economy, has impacts. You can transport invasive species and that sort of thing. I know the gypsy moth, I live in Wisconsin. The gypsy moth and the zebra mussels are two invasive species, and the primary way you spread them is by taking firewood from one place and burning it in another place, or not washing your boat off well enough when you go from one thing of water to another. But it's not a question of are there impacts, but are the impacts manageable? So we have hydrogeologists, state regulators, and that sort of thing, and they're very good at their job, so we're able to minimize the risk while accessing all of these benefits in the form of cheaper energy. So we got to talk about this. This is water contamination. You guys probably know about Gasland if you know anything about fracking, because I think that this scene where the guy lights his water on fire, I was going to say he lights his fire on water, but that's not true, is the most powerful imagery used in fracking, bar none. And the reason that that was able to happen was actually because the guy drilled his well through a coal bed, which is a natural source of methane. So whether fracking had ever been invented or not, he was going to be able to do that. So that image isn't even associated with natural gas or fracking. But there was a 5-year study by the EPA that came out. I don't know how many of you guys know about that, but they said we did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to a systemic widespread impact on drinking water. They also said that the impacts were very low relative to the amount of wells fracked. So this kind of prompted a sad reaction by Josh Fox. He said, clearly the EPA is a political body. And I say, finally, we agree on something. So let's talk about water contamination, though, because there's so much rock. There's thousands of feet of rock, and that resource can't possibly travel all the way up. These fractures that we're producing only propagate about 300 feet, really kind of depending on the formation and what kind of pressures you're using. But you can have problems if you have a bad well casing or something, or a surface spill, which can cause some sort of contamination. So I just kind of want to talk about how you protect that. They said if you case a well with cement and steel below the lowest aquifer, you are 1,000 times more likely to prevent anything bad from happening as a result of using that. So if you use multiple cases, most places use 3 to 5 cases, steel and cement, in order to prevent any impact on groundwater resources. So we're taking those precautions. I guess I just want to kind of go back. So, but there is a possibility, it's about 0.33% that you can have a bad well casing that could lead to a leak. So if you're fracking 50,000 wells, you're looking at maybe 165 instances where you have a leak, but that's not necessarily saying that that's impacting somebody, because it could be in the middle of nowhere where, you know, a methane, most of it's methane. I won't get too into the weeds here, but let's talk about the chemicals. One of the big things is we don't know what these chemicals are. They're scary. Anything's a chemical. They're using large amounts of dihydrogen monoxide. And that's the most terrifying at all, because if you breathe in too much of it, you perish. But to be serious, the amount of chemicals in this is about 4 or 9%. And most of it is like a rust inhibitor. Part of it's ice cream ingredients. So a lot of these things are used in your daily life. Some of it's bleach. So when you think about this kind of stuff, we pour bleach down our faucets all the time, and that's a really far more direct way of having that impact our water resources than having these chemicals stay down below the formation, because 80% of all the water that you pump down into the rock in order to fracture it stays down there. About 20% of it comes back up, and you capture that and you put it in steel pits. So let's talk a little bit about earthquakes, because this is a really big issue. So it isn't the process of fracturing the rock itself, because that only creates the impact, if you will, of about dropping a gallon of milk from the counter onto the floor. But what can happen is what we found is all that water that we're using, that 20% of that 2 to 4 million gallons, we're putting that back down into the ground in a disposal well. And when you do that, if you put that into the basement rock, I don't want to get too technical, essentially if you flood some of these sensitive geologic formations with too much water, you can cause some sort of earthquake. And I just want to make this clear, these are usually on the order of magnitude 3 on the momentum scale. So if you're outside, you won't notice it. If you're inside, you might, if you're just kind of sitting around watching TV and that sort of thing. But I did want to make sure that I was accurately representing this. So I emailed the head of the Oklahoma Geological Survey to say, hey, are these causing property damage? Has anybody been injured as a result of this? Because if it is, that's a problem. We need to look into this. And frankly, we need to look into this as far as finding a solution as far as earthquakes are concerned in the first place. The injection wells that are used in order to dispose of wastewater in Oklahoma and Texas are the same kind of injection wells that are used in North Dakota. But in North Dakota, they don't cause a problem because of the localized geological factors there. So we need to do a better job. In Ohio, they had some of these earthquakes, and I got a boogie because I got to talk about the economics. So anyway, if you limit the amount of volume you pump down there and the pressures that you do, you can kind of prevent this, and if you avoid fault lines. So the amount of water used for hydraulic fracturing is about 0.1% in Pennsylvania. That might be a little low based on the increases in fracking that they've had since this diagram was published, but we're using less than 1% of all the nation's water for hydraulic fracturing, and that's straight out of the EPA report. And I also want to talk about the impact on the environment from a perspective of it's not all bad. We're actually reducing the amount of acres that we need to disturb in order to get to the resource. So I just want to show you what we're doing is we're drilling multiple wells from the same pad. And this is what that kind of looks like. So you would have to have disturbed all these acres in order to do that if you were drilling straight down. But because you can go horizontal, you can actually reduce the amount of surface disturbance. And also, let's talk about the economic impact. So hundreds of thousands of jobs. By 2020, more people will be directly employed in oil and natural gas development than live in Wyoming. So that's just what I kind of like to talk about. Yellowstone's beautiful, but nobody wants to live next to it in case it blows. And then, and that's only part of it. I was reading a piece in the Washington Post today, and they were saying that 2/3 of the people that live or work in the oil industry only have a high school education. So you have a lot of men and women that only have that sort of thing, but they're making 65 grand a year. Which is something that they would not otherwise be able to do. So not only are there a lot of jobs, but they're very high quality jobs. Obviously, it's susceptible to fluctuation. But when you look at the amount that we're all saving as a result of this, the average family is saving $675 on their gasoline bill. How many people in here heat with natural gas? You guys have seen about $180 to $342 per person in your household reduction on your natural gas bill. You guys probably just thought it wasn't so cold this year when you paid less, but that's a really important factor. So you're saving about $1,400 this year, and that's because we are using hydraulic fracturing to increase the amount of energy that we have, reducing the cost. And that might not be a lot to some people, but if you're at the bottom end, if you're earning federal minimum wage, that's the same as working 225 extra hours. And that translates into real human impacts when you look at the fact that you have the lowest educational attainment in the lower incomes. Part of that's because reading to your kids is one of the best ways you can increase their educational performance. But if you don't have time to do that because you have to work another job, an extra 225 hours, that's going to have an impact on them. Childhood obesity is the highest in the lowest income bracket because the more hours you work, the more likely you are to eat at a restaurant. And it's hard to eat healthy when you eat at a restaurant. So these are just real life things that happen as a result of the fact that we work so much because of extra regulation and extra cost. So talk about the economic impacts. We pay less. This is just a graph that shows what we pay for natural gas and what the rest of the world does and the impact that that has as far as giving us a competitive advantage when it comes to things like manufacturing, really good paying jobs. We're stealing plants from Germany for steel in Houston because they can save money by coming here. Also, I just want to briefly talk about this. They've said 40,000 workers in the United States have been laid off since November. That number is probably a little low, frankly. So we had this dip in the amount of oil, the price of oil. We were over $100 a barrel, and now we're at 60. That's going to have some sort of fluctuation, and unfortunately, that's caught a lot of people in the oil patch. A lot of the people that work, because they don't have the best, that advanced education, they're a little bit. They're not as careful with their money as they should be, so they kind of got caught in a bad place. But as far as just concluding my comments here, we're saving a lot of money, not only from the low oil and natural gas prices, but that goes through all the transport. So I don't know if you guys have seen that there isn't a very big gap between between gasoline and diesel fuel now. That gap used to be a lot bigger. So everything that's transported, everything that's trucked, so you have this entire supply chain that's being affected by that. The barges, the ships, even the jet fuel and that sort of stuff is having a really big impact. So you can't just look at how much you're saving and think that that's how much you're benefiting. You're actually benefiting a lot more. There have been instances where proper precautions haven't been taken, and that's led to well casing failure or that sort of stuff that's contaminated something. But the important thing to take away from this is we have the technology and we're always getting better. We are always having stricter standards, we're getting more energy, and it's costing us less. So that's really kind of the fracking revolution that you hear about. So thank you everybody for having me. I really appreciate that.